Namaskar. Behind me are some rice fields, as you can see, which have already been harvested. And what you can see left on the ground is what is called the stubble. And now this stubble is the cause of a major news item in Delhi and Punjab, where the burning of the stubble in the rice fields of Punjab and Haryana is supposed to be contributing in large measure to the air pollution in Delhi. Let us understand this, because this is a very, very interesting story, the start, the cause, and what can be the solution to this problem. This story begins in the 1960s, yes, around 1965-66, when hybrid varieties of rice began to be grown in large quantities, began to be supported and promoted and pushed by the government of India in what is later came to be known as the Green Revolution. Now, these hybrid rice varieties were adopted fastest and most aggressively in Punjab and then in Haryana too. And then in Punjab, we had the Bakra Dam, which supplied a lot of irrigated water. And that is an important contribution to this story of air pollution in Delhi. How is the Bakra Dam water related to the air pollution in Delhi? That is because these hybrid rice varieties which were grown in Punjab required a large amounts of water. Without large-scale irrigation, it was not possible to grow these crops. Secondly, Punjab is not naturally a rice-growing area. Rice-growing areas are like this where I am, the low-lying areas, coastal areas of Maharashtra and many southern regions of the country. This is where we grow rice because water is naturally aplenty in the ground here. But in Punjab, because there was not enough groundwater, a large amount of irrigation was necessary, and that was done decade after decade after decade, and the rice production from Punjab continued to rise. Now, part 2 of the story. What happens later is that as this production of rice intensifies, the use of water also intensifies, and then the water table started to drop. It started to drop in the 80s itself, and then in the 90s it became a crisis. There was a water crisis, yes, in the Punjab, because the water table had gone so low that the government panicked, and both in Punjab as well as Haryana, they enacted laws to say that you have to delay the sowing time of the rice so that we can save some of this water and not let it go completely dry. When they did this, this happened in 2009. As a consequence, the sowing time got delayed, and what would be sown by the last week of June, usually in the Punjab, got delayed and it spilled over into July. And naturally, as a consequence, the harvesting time too was pushed. What would be almost completely done by the last week of October got pushed into November. And now, when the harvesting is delayed and it gets completed as late as November, the farmer of Punjab is in a hurry to clear the field to get it ready for the winter crop. And therefore, he resorts to burning the stubble. And that is exactly the time when Delhi is starting to experience the winter cold, when the wind speed is low and the air settles down close to the ground. But about the stubble, we have to understand why is it that there is so much more stubble in the Punjab, and why is it that there is no other alternative except to burn it? Let us have a look at what a stubble is. This is stubble. This is what is left of the rice crop, what is left on the ground after the useful part of the crop has been chopped, cut and taken out for our use. Now, if you see this rice field, which is my rice field in Sawantwadi in Maharashtra, look at how small it is. Look at how tiny it is. That is because we cut it by hand. We cut it by hand, so we cut it very close to the ground. Now, this has two uses. One is we get much more of the harvested grass, so that after we remove the rice, that dried grass is fodder for our cattle. The cows and buffaloes love this, and this is a very useful feed when fresh grass, green grass is not available. Now, this is the case all over India, by the way. So, why is it that in Punjab this fodder is not used for cattle? And two, why is it that in Punjab the size of the stubble is huge? I will show you some photographs and you will see that the stubble, which is so tiny here, just a few inches above the ground, stands up to 2 and 2.5 feet tall there. Why? Because of using machines to harvest. They do not hand cut it. Over the last few decades, the government has been pushing for more mechanization in farming here. All this is part of what is called industrial agriculture. And because of using machines, they cannot go so lower down to the ground like a human being and a human hand can to cut it. And so the machines cut it from the very top. So we get all the rice, yes, which is at the top, but we also get much less of the grass, and the rest is left on the ground to rot and decay. So the more stubble there is left on the ground, the longer it will take to rot and decay, obviously. And so you need some method to clear it. Meanwhile, why do they not use the fodder for their cattle? That is a fantastic and interesting story, because as a side effect, as a very harmful and undesirable side effect of industrial farming and using hybrid varieties of rice, is the extraordinarily large amounts of chemical fertilizers and pesticides that you have to use. So we introduce rice varieties, we give them a lot of water, a lot more than what we actually have, and then we use a lot of chemical pesticides and fertilizers which have polluted the soil to such an extent, and which has got into the content of the rice plant itself, such that the farmers in Punjab now do not want to feed this fodder, this what we call, the stubble, which is useful fodder for cows all over the rest of India. They are not being fed to the cattle in Punjab because it is harmful to the cattle. It contains so much of the chemicals which has been dumped into the soil. Part 2. Now what happens to the stubble? The long 2.5 feet high stubble in Punjab, which takes much longer to decay because of the higher quantity, and also because it has less time to decay. Because we have delayed the sowing, because we have delayed the harvesting, there is very little time left for the Punjab farmer before he can ready the field for the next winter crop, which is wheat or mustard or whatever. And so what do they do? They resort to burning it. Because of the intense sun of following the rains, the stubble has dried, and when they burn it, it is all finished in one go. And of course, during the process of burning, some useful ash, which contains some useful minerals, also gets added to the soil. But the main reasons are these two: the higher stubble because of mechanized cultivation, and the fodder being useless for cattle because of the excessive use of chemicals and fertilizers. And so the burning. So what happens when all the stubble from all over Punjab and also parts of Haryana are burnt, not early as in October, but later as in November? Now this is the time, the onset of winter, when there's a distinct weather pattern change over North India, and Delhi being a landlocked place and to the east of Punjab, and the winds bring all this smoke right from Punjab to the hinterland, and it comes over Delhi. Now Delhi, because of its unique landlocked position, is itself a very smoggy and foggy place in winter. The wind speeds are very, very low, and because of the cold, the air settles down close to the ground. And when at this time this huge quantity of stubble burning begins in Punjab and in Haryana, a lot of it obviously is carried here. And what this results in over the last 15 years to 20 years, we can see. I have faced this problem personally, and so I empathize with my friends and fellow citizens in Delhi. I'm a former Delhi resident for 17 to 18 years, and my son, when he was just 4 or 5, was in ICU in Delhi during this stubble burning and Deepavali time. because of the intense air pollution. And the moment we would leave Delhi and move out, a little higher towards the hills, it would be all right. So the effect of air pollution on our health, our lungs, especially on children, I can understand very well. But what do we do about this? Just to blame the farmers? Just to say that the farmers of Punjab, who anyway are being, branded as villains by our government for other reasons, but that I think is not the way. Please let us understand what has happened in this story so far, as I've told you. One, we use technology and some technological input, and we actually push the farmer into using some new hybrid varieties. Two, these new hybrid varieties, which are not native varieties, which are not native to this land, which are not natural varieties, are weak and therefore require a lot more water and a lot more chemical fertilizers and then chemical pesticides, both very, very toxic. Three, what happens because of this? The soil over the last 40 years has got completely polluted. Apart from the fodder, which I spoke about, you'll be surprised to know that Punjab has the highest per capita case of cancer because of this excessive chemical use. So the water table gets depleted, the soil gets polluted. Because the water table gets depleted, you force the farmers by law to postpone his sowing and harvesting time. You distort the natural timetable decided by weather for agriculture, and therefore the stubble has to be burnt because it is not fit for being fed to the cattle, and it is not decaying in time for the next winter crop. And this burning leaves the smoke which goes all the way to you in Delhi. We have to have a relook at technology, at what we are doing in the name of science. Science is beautiful. Science, after all, what does it mean? It means the truth, finding out the truth. And the story that science tells you is usually a holistic story. It is a story of harmony in nature, of different elements of this earth, the material world, the plant world, the animal world, and the human beings, how we are interrelated. And if we listen to that holistic story, we should not be getting into a technology which harms that harmony that science told us. Instead, we use a little bit of that science and then create these excessive technological interventions. And one after the other, we are creating problems. And for each so-called improvement we do, there are 10 other problems which will leave for our children and grandchildren to face the consequences of. This is a story of stubble burning and pollution, which we are now seeing as an everyday, unfortunate, tragic reality in Delhi. Let us not blame the poor farmers of Punjab. Let us do some holistic thinking at the national level so that we can root out this at the very source. Thank you. Namaskar.